Hi, today I'm going to give you a sort of crash course in typography, and as this is a game design channel, it's largely going to be aimed at game developers, but it could be a helpful refresher if you're coming from another background and you need to know about this aspect of graphic design. Typography is the sort of craft of understanding text and how text is kind of shown to people and how to make it look good, basically. So we're going to cover a few key topics that I think are most important for someone to think about if they're using typography for games. And then to sort of show you some of this applied, I'm going to look at some examples from games, both indie games and AAA games, and then I'm going to give you a guided tour of some signs in my hometown so that you can see all of these things applied together. Because the thing about typography is there are multiple things to think about. There's kind of like the kind of emotional layer of kind of what vibe does this font give me, and some of that is to do with culture and history as well. And then there's a kind of formal, how are the letters spaced and all of that kind of stuff. And there's also legibility. So the three areas really that I want to talk about are legibility, which might be a bit ironic because I know this animated background is going to get in the way occasionally throughout this, but do as I say, not as I do. What sort of things can you do to make sure your text is easy to read? The second category is kind of the cultural element and what we call semiotics, which is the study of meaning, right? So when we talk about semiotics, we're talking about what does this mean and why does it mean that? So there's lots of cultural baggage that can come along with a font or a typeface. The kind of style and what we associate it with, and kind of different time periods that it might come from, all of that kind of stuff that you need to bear in mind when you're doing this kind of work. And the last category is on here because it is important, but I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time talking about it because the symbol there, the V and the A, is to represent kerning, which is like the spacing of letters. And this is a rabbit hole that if you're doing traditional print-based graphic design, you could fall down forever. There is so much kind of to learn about how letters are put together, what the names of the different parts of the letters are, and so on. And as I said, the kind of spacing and kerning. Now, if letters are spaced incorrectly, it can lead to strange things like it looking like there are gaps between words when there aren't, and all of that kind of stuff. But generally speaking, when we're using a game engine, we don't have a great deal of control over this. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about this area, although there will be some key things to kind of point out. Now, the simplest rule of thumb that I wish people started from when they are making a game is to just use two fonts and to have a clear idea of what each one is for. So this is the font that we use for headings, and this is the font that we use for any kind of large chunk of text that we would call like the body of a document. Now, I'm sure you can find examples of things that look great that use more than two fonts, but by and large, this is a good rule of thumb to start with because it starts you thinking in this way, which is kind of the more advanced way of thinking of it, which is that when you add a new text style, there should be a logical reason for it. So every time you introduce a new font, or you introduce a variant of an existing font, like you add italics or bold or underlining it, there should be a reason why you're doing that. In games, there are kind of specific use cases for when we might do this. We might have damage numbers that pop up during combat. That's an example of a special use case where we might apply a different font or a different set of rules for a font. There might be explanations for how an item works, and when there is a keyword, like you get poisoned, right? That's a status change, that's a keyword. That might be something that we use bold for. Flavor text in games presented in italics or in a different style of font, and that is to help players quickly glance at it and know that that is kind of story information. It's not what I need to know in order to play the game. But generally speaking, every time you introduce some new typeface, there should be a logical reason for it, and this should become part of the visual language of your game, whereby if there's italic text, then italic text means the same thing across the whole game. If there's an underline, it means the same thing across the whole game. Collectible card games are a really good example of this, and they're kind of bridge the gap between print graphic design and what we see in video games. And if you look at these, like the Hearthstone example on the right that's closest to me, you've got the same text used for the title of the card, the big numbers and the type of minion it is at the bottom where it says beast, and that's this big chunky white text with a black outline. It's kind of a more decorative font. It has serifs, which are the little sticky out feet and stuff, and generally speaking, fonts with serifs make us think of like older time periods, because they come from a time when we were printing with physical machines, and so the letters were designed to have these corners on to prevent the ink from running and to kind of prevent wear on the machine as well. You can see the bit underneath where it says rush poisonous, and that's an example of keywords being highlighted in a particular way, like I mentioned a moment ago. But all of that rule text that's in that bottom rectangle, you notice it's in a very clean, straight font. It doesn't have serifs. All of that makes it easier to read, and it needs to be easier to read because it's presenting more complex information. It's presenting a whole sentence of information. You can see some similar rules in the Magic the Gathering card on the left. We've got a slightly different text that's used for the heading, the name of the creature, and then we've got a kind of simpler text used for the body, which actually is a serif font here, but it's not a kind of fancy decorative one. And then that bit where it says there once was a player named Quinn, and you'll often see that in Magic the Gathering cards. They use italics to tell a bit of story about the world or make some strange little joke about that particular card. Two of the most popular card games to have ever been made, we don't see loads and loads of fonts. We see fonts that are used in very specific ways and kind of a sense of there are rules about when something is bold or when it's italic and on all of this kind of stuff. And that's what you need to develop for your game, is a set of rules, a set of visual language that you use consistently throughout all of the typography, all of the text that's shown in your game. Now, there are several really common legibility crimes that kind of make things hard to read, and as I said, some of this is going to be ironic because the animated background I've got on behind my slides is probably getting in the way of this. But the first one, and the most common one I see, is having full sentences in all capitals. This is bad for multiple reasons. One is it does look like you're shouting. A lot of us have sort of built up this association on the internet and private messaging that someone typing in all caps is shouting at us. But more importantly, it makes your text harder to read, and it's particularly difficult for people who have dyslexia or a visual impairment. And the reason for that is that capital letters tend to all kind of go up and down to the same point in the line. So if you look at that sentence where it says full sentences in all capitals and you compare it to the other legibility crimes, it's very kind of blocked out in a straight line because the letters are all the same size. That makes it very difficult to discern the letters if you have some difficulty reading. So whenever you use all caps, it should only really be to emphasize one thing, or maybe for something like, you know, the name of an item or the heading of something, where it's never going to be a long sentence. It's always just a block of text that's maybe 5 words long at the most. As soon as you're writing full sentences that have multiple parts in, you're going to make it hard to read if it's in all caps. And one of the worst responses you can have to this complaint is to say, well, the font I used is only capital letters. Well, get a different font then. You don't have to use that one. There are some kind of edge cases where sometimes for stylistic reasons you want to use all caps. For example, it's very difficult to do something with a comic book font and make it look authentic without doing it in all caps, because comic books have been in all caps for, 50, 60 years, but that is starting to change now. Now, the second one on the list, using fonts that are very decorative unnecessarily. So I'm not talking about like the title of your game on the splash screen. I'm talking about text that's actually in the game once you start playing it. If you use a very curly font like that, it's gonna be hard to read. I'm gonna give you an example of why this is important in a minute. If you don't care about it yet, maybe the next slide is gonna make you care about it. The other one is varying the size of your text too much. So to go back to the playing cards, there is a tiny piece of text in the corner of the Magic the Gathering card that is the kind of copyright information and the name of the artist. It's okay that that is really small because it's very rare that you're actually going to need to read it, and you almost certainly don't need to read it as part of the gameplay. But if we'd made that jump in size on the card itself, on the gameplay important information, then that kind of creates this moment where players need to read the larger text, and then when they go to read the smaller text, they sort of have to refocus in. I used to see this issue quite a lot, not just in students' games, but also in documents like pitch documents. If you have, you know, one slide in a deck of slides and it has 3 sentences on it and they're nice big text, and then the next slide you switch to loads of text and it's all really tiny, that kind of creates this moment of ugh in the audience's brain and kind of they're more likely to switch off at that moment and not want to read the next bit because you've made them have to kind of refocus from one text size to another. So try not to have massive differences in the size of text. It's okay to have much smaller text if it's for something that is kind of, you know, small text, you know, copyright information, stuff like that, but not for things that players actually need to read in order to play. And then the last one is poor contrast. So in this example, I've put it in a pale text that is not going to show up very well on my blue background, but it could be the opposite problem. It could be like red text on a green background. It could be something that creates like visual distortion. And of course, in games, this issue can be particularly pronounced because you're often putting text over something that is moving around in a background, and that can be why you might need to bring in something like outlining or drop shadow on your text, or putting a transparent vignette behind it so that whatever is moving around behind that and exploding, whatever is happening in the game, isn't hurting the legibility of that text. I think most of the things on this list are pretty obvious. The capitals one is the one that usually catches people out. There is a fantastic book about design, and it's not specifically about game design. I think it is more aimed at sort of graphic designers, web designers and stuff, but this is a fantastic book, and I do recommend every game designer pick it up. Susan Weinschenk's 100 Things Every Designer Needs to Know About People. There's quite a few things in this about legibility and how to do text display well, but one of my favorite tidbits of information here is this basketball study that they did, where basically they would give people an instruction on paper to do a particular, you know, set of throws in a basketball court, and they gave people different writing on the paper that was easier or harder to read, and they tended to find that when you gave people the harder to read instruction, they performed worse at the task, right? So if they were kind of using a bad decorative font like the one I showed you there, and the kind of people in the experiment couldn't read it very easily, then when they'd eventually read it and tried to do the basketball throws, they performed worse at it. So there's some kind of psychological thing going on where when you give people an instruction in text, if they can't read it properly, then they perform worse when they try and carry out that instruction, which is really interesting. And I think there are other examples of this in the book. Every time you present text to people that has poor legibility, you're sort of setting them up to react negatively to that in a way that has some sort of knock-on effect with what they're trying to do. And it might just kind of make them not like you as well. If you're kind of giving someone who struggles to read anyway, like someone with a visual impairment or dyslexia, giving them a massive ream of text to read and it's all in capitals, you kind of have all of this psychological knock-on effect. Your audience is kind of scrunching up their face, getting grumpy about it, and that's going to impact everything about how they interact with the thing that you've designed them to do. So moving on to the sort of cultural element of typography and what it all means. Whenever you hear me refer to semiotics in this video, I'm talking about this. Semiotics is the study of what symbols mean and why they mean what they mean. So like I said, when you look at a piece of typography and you go, oh, that's a sci-fi one or that's a fantasy one, that's what's going on. There's some semiotics happening. There's a set of cultural symbols attached to that typography, attached to that typeface, that you're able to read and interpret based on media that you've seen in the past. So on one level, there's this kind of tone emotional aspect, which is, does the typography look serious or does it look friendly? It could be a dichotomy, like does it look whimsical or kind of playful, or does it look formal? You can kind of guess the sort of genre and the tone of these games from looking at the typography. The bottom one looks very serious. It looks like it might be in a kind of sci-fi area or maybe some sort of spy thriller type thing, and the top one looks a lot kind of cozier and friendlier. And if you look at the shape of the fonts as well, the top one is a lot more decorative. It's got a lot more round shapes in. It kind of looks friendlier than the one at the bottom, which looks something more kind of formal and serious. And if I were to show you these and you didn't know what games they were from, we could infer so many things from these about which of these games contains the most fighting and all of that kind of stuff. It's all there embedded in the way the font looks and fonts we've seen in the past and the associations we have with them. And some of that comes from this, which is the kind of historical aspect of typography. When we see particular types of writing, we have associations from, like, where do they come from in history? So you've got the Roman numerals there that are made using a chisel. And the way that Roman numerals are written, it's kind of very straight lines, and we associate it with something that is carved in stone, that is made with a chisel. And then you've got medieval black letter, which is associated with using a quill to write, and writing in a very decorative style, because this was a time in history when the only writing that was happening in kind of big books were kind of monks creating these illuminated manuscripts and so on. Over on the right, we've got the example that definitely breaks my two font rule, which is kind of like these Victorian bottle labels and stuff, and they have loads and loads of decorative use of typography. So if you plan making a game set in that era which is like Victorian or sort of Wild West, then you sort of have to look at all this and work out how you're going to do it. And it could start to get very complicated in terms of any in-world posters and stuff like that you need to do. The point is that even if we're not consciously aware of it, lots of typography has a kind of attachment to a particular point in history and the sort of materials and processes that we use to make it. And some of this can come from other media, like films, music, and so on. Over here, you've got It Came From the Desert, which is a pretty good game from around 1990. And you can see how the front of that box is designed to look like an old 1950s B-movie. They always had that kind of dripping text. Sometimes it would be small on one side and big on the other, and it would be this kind of big decorative. If you imagine like the Indiana Jones titles, that's kind of what we associate with certain genres of pulp film. Ape Out, all of the graphic design and the use of typography in this is based on 1960s and onward like film intros by an artist called Saul Bass. So it's kind of this association between the jazz music that's in the game and all of these kind of visual styles, including the typography, tying into like graphic design stuff from the 60s. And then with BioShock, we've got this kind of 1920s cabaret Art Deco style, which is telling us the time period that the game's set in. It's going to tell us the sort of architecture we're going to see in the game, and again, the typography follows that all the way through. These are using audiences' understanding of other art movements from history, other types of pop culture, and kind of putting it into games. Like I said before, I'm not going to spend long on form and shape, because all of this stuff is stuff that you maybe don't have so much control over in a game engine, right? If there are issues with the spacing of specific characters, often in a game engine you just need to pick another font, because you can't individually typeset the different letters in every piece of writing. Some examples from games. I was sent Power Champions to review a few months ago, and I think this one just felt a little bit messy in terms of how many fonts there are. They're going to be a bit small on your screen, but you've got this very sci-fi looking font used all along the top, which sort of reminds me of if you saw like a 90s sci-fi movie, like a Terminator or something like that, or like a Michael Bay movie. And it's kind of difficult to read. I don't like those zeros with the crosses through the middle. There's a lot of things that make that text hard to read, particularly when it's changing. And then there's some story text where the character is speaking that is in a very different style. They sort of don't look like they go together. And then in the bottom right, we've got that kind of more plain serif style being used again, but it doesn't have the outlines. It's just, there's a lot going on here in terms of fonts being used, and I can't always tell why a particular font is being used for a particular thing. Here's what I think is an excellent example. Mini Metro is a game about building metro stations, and You can probably intuit this from looking here, but if you've ever been on a train station, they've based the graphic design of this game on that. I think it was specifically based on the graphic design of the signs and leaflets and all the brochures for the New York transport system. So this is a good example of a process you can go through if your game or whatever project you're working on is set in a particular time and space. You can go and try and find the style guides that are associated with that and see like what kind of graphic design rules and typographic rules were used in subway systems or restaurants or whatever it is you're doing. Go and look at examples of the typography used from that time. Here's an example from Diablo 3, and you can see the sort of signature typography from Diablo that has those sort of gothic crosses in the O. It's very kind of over-the-top stylized goth, and it's just something that I think people associate very heavily with the game since the first one. So they've kept it in there, they've used it for the header, but all of the text that we need to read to understand what this weapon does and its rules is in a very plain font. And that might not look great to you. It does make it a lot quicker to read because you don't have serifs. And serifs are another typographic element that basically slow readers down. It doesn't look pretty, but it does what it needs to do, which is give information in a very clear way. And I think if you were to break down that image that we're looking at even more, you could start to think about how is color used. The white text pops out at you more than the grey text, and there's some other color symbolism going on to do with rarity and stuff like that. So there's lots of potential things to think about in this image. I just want to stop briefly in the midpoint of the video to let you know about our Discord. Everyone on it is basically either a developer whose game I've reviewed on this show or someone who is supporting the channel via Patreon. So if you're able to do that, if you're able to support us via Patreon or a YouTube subscription, then you do get access to my Discord. And it's basically a place where you can get support from other game developers. You can kind of show people your ideas, get feedback on there. I'm on there on a daily basis giving people feedback from my kind of experience of working in the games industry and making my own games and teaching game developers at university. And I think it's quite a special community because it is all game developers, and that means we don't get kind of flooded with which engine should I use and how to get started, like beginner 101 questions. It's much more focused on people who are already making games and want to sort of learn game design so that they can make better games, rather than just how do I get started kind of stuff. Because I tend to find that the open forums on places like Reddit and Facebook, often they do get a bit kind of saturated with beginner level questions about what's the first thing I should do to get started making games. So if you're already making games and that community sounds appealing to you, you can join us via Patreon. You can also join via a YouTube subscription and kind of become one of the founding members of that Discord group, because we're still at under 100 members, so you'll be getting in early, and you'd be helping support this channel so that I can keep on pumping out videos and providing educational resources for game designers that are free, rather than, you know, having to go down the route of making private courses and selling them, which I don't really want to have to do. Okay, here's the fun bit. We've seen a couple of examples in games. I just want to take you through sort of a guided tour of some signs that I've seen in my own town as I go around. And this will help you to kind of see typography being analysed. And I promise you, by the end of this video, you'll be so typography pilled that you won't be able to stop doing this kind of analysis, and every time you go outside of the house and you see a sign, you'll be doing this. Sunrise Cafe. First thing that jumps to mind is that it is friendly, right? There's big like balloon letters. They kind of look friendly. They look chubby. They've got serifs on, which kind of make it look a bit old-fashioned. This is kind of a typography I have a very strong association with, like the 1970s in Britain with, and the use of the warm colours kind of gives you that as well. But it does what it needs to do, right? It's welcoming. It's for a cafe where you go and buy some sausages and eggs and stuff. This one is strange. Raj's Asian Supermarket. This typeface I would associate with circus posters, and maybe they're used for like carnival in the States. And these are like big wooden block printed letters that you would have got in Victorian times. For me, it's a very strong association with the circus. I wouldn't have used it for this sign, and I'm not sure if the owner knows that there's that association, but you know, it is what it is. It's eye-catching at the very least. Now, what do you think when you see this one? It's a sans serif font. It's got no serifs. Kind of makes it look a bit more modern. It's kind of slick looking. There's no capital letter, which as well is a choice that kind of makes you read it in a particular way. This is the kind of sign you have when you want to assure people that this is a classy pizza place now. It is no longer the most violent pub in the town centre. I really don't know what's going on here. Why would you do that? I'm scared and confused. This is where you go to sell your jewellery when you're in debt. It does what it needs to. It kind of looks formal. There's something about the kind of squareness of the letters and how tall they are that makes it kind of come across as quite formal. You've got an inconsistency there between the typography used on the main sign and the typography used down at the bottom where it's got wanted for cash. That has like a gradient on it and it's in a very different style. But overall, the color scheme ties it together and it doesn't stand out too bad. You will see examples later on where the more different typefaces are used, the more kind of tacky and chaotic it ends up looking. Limani. I think this is a fashion shop. It's really low contrast compared to the other places. You almost don't notice the sign at the top because the sign on the window stands out more. But this kind of lower contrast is meant to look retro. It's meant to look like something quite old. It's kind of got a classy vibe. It looks hand painted as well, which gives us a different vibe than seeing like big plastic letters that have a light behind them or something. This kind of feels like it's going for a kind of demure retro kind of thing, which makes sense if it's a fashion shop like a boutique. Look at this, it's beautiful. We used to live in a proper society where people had elegant decorative windows outside their businesses. No more. Now this one, I have to go back and forth between these two images because it has the orange sign, the blue and white sign, that red and white sign, and the silver one. It's got like 4 different signs all the way round, so that you cannot go past this business and come away from it without a sense of what it does. Yeah, it's got lots of signs. None of them are in the same style, but they are informative, and we know what we can get here. I just like the idea that they're just going to add a new one every 5 years and never get rid of the old ones, and the signs are just going to gradually go up and up the building until it has like 20. Harbour Gallery, another hand-painted one. It's got like a sort of, it's not even a drop shadow, it's like a 3D embossment thing coming out of the back of it. And then there's also a line between that and the other one. So if you were imagining trying to render some of this in an engine, you would have to outline the yellow with the red of the sign and then put the grey blue one behind it. It's really nice technique. It sort of looks like it's meant to replicate if the sign was made out of wood and if the letters were made out of wood and it sort of extruded from the sign. It's giving that kind of impression, but it's very pretty. And again, if you were making a game set in a particular time period, you might have to generate lots of these, right? If you say, oh, my game is set in a Victorian town, you've made yourself a lot of work in terms of generating this kind of typography, but it does give you a sense of that kind of time period. To be honest, this one is just on here because I thought the name was funny and I wanted to show you this tiny little door, which is like, I'm only 5'8" and I would have to stoop to go in this tiny little gallery, so that's cute. This one I feel a bit bemused by because that typography to me is sort of XCOM, right? It's like a sci-fi thriller thing. It's the Michael Bay one again. It's like opening scenes of Transformers and it's telling you, oh, this is happening on Unicron Prime, and it comes up in this text. So I can't really work out how that relates to boats unless they sell really like high-tech cyber boats that might turn against their owner. This one is lovely. You can see they've used kind of the shape of traditional Greek letters to kind of get the Greekness in there. And then you've got the sign is made in mosaics. Just think about what we said earlier on about there being this kind of this layer of cultural associations when you look at text. You've got the shape, you've got the material, you've got the set of colours. It's all doing Greekness. You know, they're trying to market this as, come here, to eat, you will get a genuine Greek experience, not like that muck they serve down the road, right? And it's giving all of this kind of authenticity. And even though you've got the Greek arch and then like a sign above it that doesn't really match, it kind of doesn't matter, because it kind of adds to this sort of bohemian sense to have the multiple different ways of presenting the text. Like I said, the two font rule is really a rule of thumb. There are contexts where having lots of different types of typography do something beneficial. Like often it's done to create a sense of something being retro or bohemian, to have lots of different types of text. That doesn't mean that you should necessarily do that in games for text that is supposed to be easy for people to read, like the dialogue or the tutorials. But when you're designing materials that appear in a world, like shop signs and posters and things like that, you might want to think about, you know, what context is it appropriate to have lots of different types of typography, because sometimes it is a stylistic choice. And if you want your game worlds to feel believable, then you need to sort of see when that happens in the real world and copy it as appropriate. Here's another very retro looking one, and again you can think of the typographies that you can see there, which are different from each other, but they've both got a similar sort of vibe. They've both got that very curly S, and they sort of walk the line between feeling like formal and old-fashioned, but being slightly whimsical at the same time. Flowers have these associations with, like, you know, romanticism and kind of particular types of values that we also associate with, like, the good old days. And if you're interested in graphic design more generally, you can start to think about how the color combination of that sort of dull gold color and the dark green, and those things combine with the typography to create this feeling. And also the borders as well. If you look at the border on that window, there's this kind of rounded edge border that is kind of playing into that as well. It's evoking particular time periods, and it's kind of helping to create associations, emotional associations with the business. Corby's Tea Rooms are sadly not open anymore, but you can see this has the same type of borders around the frames as the last one. It has those little rounded bits in, because it's evoking a specific time period. And again, we've got that hand painted style, very, very decorative. There's almost a sense here that you couldn't create text like this without having someone hand design it, and that kind of in turn creates a sense of quality of, like, this wasn't just typed in with a computer, this was made by a craftsperson, right? RIP Corby's Tea Rooms. Mariner's Bar. You can see there's very, very consistent use of this quite bold sans serif font in the sign, and it's above the door there as well, and on the hanging signs it's very consistent. Like I said, the more different typographies you use, unless it's done in a very deliberate stylistic way like those Victorian bottle labels we saw earlier, having a kind of noisy chaos of different typography does tend to end up looking tacky. So when you look at this building from a distance, you see that the sign above the door matches the other signs, it looks clean, it looks professional. There are other bits of typography like advertising events and stuff that are on posters when you get closer in, and they don't really match. They kind of look like they haven't really looked at the rest of the graphic design associated with the building when they've done those. Royal Harbour Emporium, kind of hard to read in this Gothic black letter, but you can sort of see how there are some cultural associations being built up here between the Gothic black letter is old, and this is a shop where you would go to buy old antique things, and there's also perhaps an association between that kind of medieval like visual style and motorbikes. So the idea of, like, bikers being associated with kind of things that are medieval looking. There's a sort of a biker / knight kind of association that goes on in biker culture, and you will see it in, like, the kind of chapter patches that people have on their leather jackets and stuff like that, and that's kind of what's being evoked here. Big old stencil font. Very hard to find a stencil font that isn't all in caps. but it does kind of evoke particular things, and you will have an association probably with the military, and particularly like military things set in Vietnam or in a kind of jungle based regions, the Worms games, where a lot of the time they use this kind of typography. But there's also an association with sort of imports and exports and the type of stamps that you'd get on like a crate of bananas or something. So that's why they're drawing on it for this association with the tropical, right? It kind of makes total sense that it's been used in this context. And even the front of the business looks like a big wooden crate. So hopefully now you are typography pilled enough that you can do this exercise in your own town and go around and point at everyone's signs and go, look at that. Why did they do that? Or go, oh, that's a nice one. And just stand outside a business clapping their sign and saying bravo. These are the kind of key considerations. You've got legibility. Can I read it? Particularly in a game where you're reading instructions and you're reading how to play, just having large blocks of text that are hard to read you're just setting yourself up to fail as a designer if you're expecting players to jump through that hoop of squinting at some writing that's hard to read, and you just don't want to do that. So don't do it. It's this second point about the kind of cultural baggage that typography has is probably the more fun area to dabble in. When you are making a game that is set in the Wild West, how do you convey that through the typography? When you're making a game that's set in the Caribbean with pirates and so on, there are typographic choices that are going to help to immerse the player in the world, because it will evoke the associations that they as players have with other media and other art movements and so on throughout history. And you need to be able to do that, but you also need to balance that with legibility. So going back to the Diablo example, that's a brilliant example of a game that has a very stylized decorative font that evokes a very specific thing. It's like, Gothic medievalism. This is the type of font that you would see on a plaque in a cathedral or on a gravestone, and it's giving all those dark Gothic vibes that are so important to what Diablo is and is about. But then the functional text, the text that the player really needs to read lots of to understand the game, is in a sans serif font. It's in a very clear, clean font, and that makes it easier to read. And it's always this balancing act between, which text in your game is there to provide some artistic flair and which just needs to be easy to read. Because every time you ask players to switch between focusing on one type of writing and then reading a different font, it's like creating a little cognitive roadblock in their mind, a little bump for them to get over. Those of you who speak more than one language will have been in situations before where you're listening to a speaker and they speak in one language and then someone else speaks in another language, and you have to do this kind of double take in your brain to switch to listening to a different language. And switching between reading very different types of typefaces in a short period of time is very similar to that. It's a bump mentally in terms of your understanding of what you're looking at. If you're making a game and you found this helpful, perhaps if you're new to the channel, then say hi, drop a comment below, please subscribe, all of that stuff. But I've also got an email address where you can get in contact with me, indiegameclinic@gmail.com, and there's a number of things I can help you with. The first one is, if you send me a game and I play it on a stream and I think it's interesting and I think there's something that other game developers can learn from it, then I may incorporate it into a video. Don't just send me games expecting me to cover them like a games journalist, because this is a game design channel, so I tend to look for games that are good examples of something, or games that I can analyze in a way that will be helpful to other designers. So don't just send me random stuff. You need to be looking for design advice rather than just kind of positive feedback, because I'm not really about that. You can also contact me for freelance design help. So if you're stuck with a project and you want to know what to do next, or you want me to kind of read through your design documents and point out any danger areas and stuff like that, I can do that with you. And the last point is any sort of coaching and mentoring stuff. If you want someone to speak to on a regular basis, could be once a week, could be once a month, to sort of talk through things that you're stuck with creatively, whether it's games or another medium, then I do provide this coaching and mentoring service. And remember, this comes from someone with a background of working in the games industry, but also like at least 5 years teaching adults how to make games and how to do other types of creative pursuits like graphic design and music and so on. I've worked with lots of people in lots of different disciplines to kind of help them get better at what they're trying to do. The thing about coaching is it's not teaching, so I don't do one-to-one lessons showing you how to use a game engine. You need to already be doing that yourself. But if you're working on projects and you want some guidance to, maybe help you develop better habits, or maybe point you in the direction of things it would be good for you to play or read as research for what you're doing, then I can help with that kind of stuff, and I can do it on a kind of rolling basis with you if you're looking for a coach or a mentor in games or any kind of adjacent creative area. So thanks for listening today. I look forward to seeing your new games with much better typographic choices made in them after this video.